You just paid $2 for a genuine leather wallet, $3 for noise-canceling headphones, and somehow a wedding dress for $28. Shipping? Technically free, but it'll arrive sometime between next month and the heat death of the universe. Your first thought is probably, this is definitely a scam. Your second thought, whatever, it's $2. But here's what should really mess with your head. Wish isn't just selling you questionable products. At their peak, they were worth $14 billion. That's billion with a B. And they built that empire by convincing millions of people that buying a phone charger shaped like a banana for 87 cents was a totally normal thing to do. So, how does a company that sells products cheaper than your morning coffee actually stay in business? The answer is way wilder than you think, and it reveals a business model that's part genius, part chaos, and entirely fascinating. Hi, and welcome to the channel where I analyze business models so you don't have to. Today we're diving deep into Wish, the shopping app that's equal parts treasure hunt and dumpster dive. And to understand how they actually make money, we're gonna follow our friend Sarah on her Wish shopping adventure and break down every single dollar along the way. Because unlike Temu, Wish was founded in 2010 by Peter Solchevsky and is actually a public company, which means we have real financial data to work with. And trust me, those numbers tell an absolutely wild story. Let's start with Sarah. She's scrolling through Instagram at 2 a.m., doing that thing where you're not really looking at anything but also can't stop scrolling when she sees it. An ad for a smartwatch that looks suspiciously like an Apple Watch. Price? $4.37. Now Sarah knows this is probably garbage. She's not an idiot. But here's the thing, it's $4.37. She spends more than that on a single coffee. So what does she have to lose? This is exactly the psychological trap Wish has perfected. Wish burns through marketing budget like it's going out of style. At their peak, they were spending over $1 billion a year on advertising. That's roughly $3 to $4 per order, just on marketing. Plastered their ads everywhere. YouTube, Instagram, Facebook, even billboards in major cities. Remember those Wish ads that were basically just slideshows of weird products with dramatic music? Yeah, those weren't cheap. Their strategy was simple, but expensive. Show people the most bizarre, inexplicable products at prices so low they seem fake, and watch curiosity do the rest. And it worked. Wish was downloaded over 500 million times and became one of the most popular shopping apps in the world. But here's where things get interesting. Unlike Temu, which spends money to get you hooked on the app itself, Wish is banking on you being hooked on the prices. They want you thinking, sure, the last 3 things I bought were trash, but this smartwatch is only $4.37. How bad could it be? So Sarah clicks buy. She's ordering the smartwatch, a pair of sunglasses for $1.50, and what the website claims is a premium silk scarf for $2.12. Total cost? $8.34. Shipping shows is free, which we'll talk about in a minute because that's where things get really interesting. For Wish, this sale means they're collecting about $7.96 after payment processing fees. Now here's where Wish's business model starts to reveal itself. Just like Temu, Wish doesn't own any of this stuff. They're not sitting on warehouses full of fake smartwatches and questionable silk scarves. Wish is purely a marketplace connecting Sarah to merchants, almost all of whom are based in China. When Sarah clicks buy, Wish forwards her order to a merchant somewhere in Shenzhen or Guangzhou. That merchant then ships the product directly to Sarah. Wish never touches it. They're just the platform making the introduction. And for this service, Wish takes a cut. Here's where it gets interesting. Wish's commission structure is actually pretty aggressive. They typically take 15 to 20% of the sale price, plus various fees that merchants have to pay for things like promoted listings, better search placement, and faster payouts. Let's break down Sarah's $8 order. On average, Wish is taking about 18% commission. That's about $1.50. But wait, there's more. Merchants also pay Wish to promote their products. It's basically an internal advertising system. If a merchant wants their fake smartwatch to show up higher in search results, they pay Wish extra. These advertising fees typically add another 5 to 10% on top of the commission. So on Sarah's order, Wish is making about $1.50 in commission, plus another 40 cents in merchant ad. Vertising fees. That's $1.90 total. Now you might be thinking that doesn't sound like much. And you'd be absolutely right, because that $1.90 is about to get eaten alive by Wish's costs. Remember, Wish just spent $3 to $4 on marketing to acquire Sarah as a customer. They made $1.90 on her purchase. They're already down $1.10 to $2.10, and we haven't even talked about operating costs yet. Running a global e-commerce platform isn't free. Wish has to pay for servers, app development, customer service, fraud prevention, and general operations. At their scale, these costs work out to roughly $1.50 per order. So now Wish is down about $2.60 to $3.60 on Sarah's purchase. Payment processing takes another 3%, or about 25 cents. That brings the total loss to somewhere between $2.85 and $3.85 per order. But we haven't even gotten to the really interesting part yet: shipping. Sarah sees free shipping on her order, but shipping from China to the US isn't free, not even close. Normally, shipping a small package internationally costs $15 to $25. If Wish had to pay that, their entire business model would collapse instantly. But Wish discovered the same loophole that Temu uses, and they've been exploiting it for even longer: the de minimis exemption. Any package worth less than $800 doesn't have to go through normal customs and doesn't get charged import duties. Wish keeps every order under that threshold, which is easy when you're selling smartwatches for $4, and boom, no tariffs. But there's another piece to this puzzle: the Universal Postal Union Treaty. This is an international agreement that's supposed to make it cheaper for developing countries to send mail. China, despite being the world's second largest economy, still benefits from this treaty. The result? Chinese merchants can ship packages to the US for a fraction of what it would cost an American business to ship the same package domestically. We're talking $3 to $5 instead of $20. For Sarah's order, Wish's merchant partners are paying roughly $4 for shipping. Now, you might ask, wait, doesn't the merchant pay for shipping, not Wish? Yes, technically. But here's the thing: merchants price their shipping costs into their margins, and since Wish takes a percentage of the sale, and since merchants are operating on razor-thin margins to begin with, Wish is indirectly tied to these shipping economics. If shipping were more expensive, merchants would have to charge more, customers would buy less, and Wish would make less money. The whole system depends on shipping being artificially cheap. But here's where Wish's model differs from Temu in a crucial way. Wish often charges for shipping, or at least they used to before regulatory pressure forced changes. Sometimes shipping was $1, sometimes $3. Sometimes it was technically free. The product price was 50 cents higher. Wish played games with shipping costs constantly, testing what customers would tolerate. This gave them a little more flexibility to recoup costs. But it also made the shopping experience confusing and sometimes frustrating. Get back to Sarah's order and tally up where Wish stands financially. Sarah paid $8.34. Wish collected $1.90 in commissions and fees. Their costs so far are about $3 to $4 in marketing, $1.50 in operating costs, and 25 cents in payment processing. That's a loss of roughly $2.85 to $3.85. And we haven't even factored in returns, fraud, and customer service issues, which add another 50 cents per order on average. So Wish is losing about $3 to $4 on Sarah's order. Multiply that by millions of orders, and you can see why Wish lost hundreds of millions of dollars per year at their peak growth phase. In 2020, Wish lost $745 million. In 2019, they lost $115 million. So how the hell does Wish plan to make money? The answer is actually pretty similar to Temu's playbook, but with some key differences. Wish is betting on the classic Silicon Valley strategy: lose money to acquire customers, build massive scale, then figure out profitability later. Wish went public in 2020, which meant they had to answer to shareholders and eventually show a path to profitability. The plan had several components. First, grow the user base like crazy. At their peak in 2020, Wish had 107 million monthly active users. That's a lot of people hooked on cheap stuff. Second, once you have that scale, you have leverage. You can raise prices slightly, increase commission rates, charge merchants more for advertising, and reduce marketing spending. Those small changes, multiplied by millions of orders, should theoretically lead to profitability. Third, use data. Wish collects insane amounts of information on what people buy, what prices convert best, and what products are trending. That data is valuable, both for optimizing their own platform, potentially selling insights back to merchants. But here's where Wish's story gets really interesting, because unlike Temu, we can see exactly what happened when they tried to execute this plan. And spoiler alert, it didn't go great. Let's talk about why. First, the quality problem. Wish built its entire brand on ultra-cheap prices, but that came at a cost. Quality. The products on Wish became legendary for being terrible. That smartwatch, sunglasses, and silk scarf Sarah ordered? It arrived 6 weeks later and was of bad quality. Now Sarah spent $8. She's annoyed, but not that annoyed. She's not going to bother returning anything because shipping it back to China would cost more than she paid. So she just accepts it and moves on. And this is where Wish's model starts to crack. Because sure, Sarah might order again. The prices are so low that another $8 gamble doesn't feel like a big deal. But over time, the disappointment adds up. She starts checking Amazon first, or Target, or literally anywhere else where she might actually get something decent. Wish trained customers to expect garbage, and eventually that caught up with them. By 2021, Wish's active users started declining. Monthly active users dropped from 107 million to 90 million, then 64 million, then 42 million. People were getting tired of the slot machine. The thrill of maybe getting something good wasn't enough anymore. The losses were starting to outweigh the entertainment value. And this is the fundamental problem with Wish's business model. They attracted customers with unsustainably low prices, but they couldn't deliver quality at those prices. And once customers figured that out, they left. Second, the regulatory hammer started falling. Remember that de minimis loophole and the postal treaty that made cheap shipping possible? Governments started paying attention. The US began discussing changes to the de minimis threshold. There were also increasing concerns about product safety. Because Wish products bypass normal customs inspections, regulators started finding dangerous items. Products with unsafe materials, counterfeit goods, items that violated safety standards. Wish faced investigations and pressure to clean up their marketplace. That meant more cost for compliance, monitoring, and removal of problematic listings. Third, the intellectual property nightmare. Wish's platform was absolutely flooded with knockoffs, fakes, and trademark violations. You could buy Adidas shoes for $5, Ray-Ban sunglasses for $3, Gucci bags for $12. None of it was real, obviously. Major brands started suing. Wish had to invest in systems to detect and remove counterfeit listings, deal with legal challenges, and manage relationships with brands who were understandably pissed off. This added yet another layer of cost to an already struggling business model. Fourth, competition intensified. When Wish started, they had a relatively unique position, but then everyone copied them. Amazon launched its own discount section. Temu exploded onto the scene with even more aggressive pricing and better execution. AliExpress, which had been around longer, started improving its mobile experience. Suddenly, Wish wasn't the only game in town for cheap stuff from China. Customers had no loyalty to Wish specifically. They were loyal to getting deals. If they could get better deals, or the same deals with slightly better quality, somewhere else, they'd leave. And they did. Let's talk about the merchants for a second. Because Wish's relationship with its merchants was, let's say, complicated. Wish had tremendous leverage over merchants. They controlled access to millions of customers. They could change commission rates, alter search algorithms, or suspend accounts with little warning. Merchants had to play by Wish's rules or lose access to a huge market. But this created problems. Merchants, desperate to compete on price, would cut corners everywhere. Quality suffered even more. Shipping times got longer as merchants chose the cheapest possible methods. Customer service was virtually non-existent. And when customers complained, Wish was caught in the middle. Every bad experience reflected on Wish's brand. Wish tried to implement quality controls and merchant ratings, but it was like trying to bail out a sinking ship with a teaspoon. Tightened quality standards. They tried to improve the merchant vetting process. They reduced marketing spending to cut losses. They raised prices slightly and increased commissions. On paper, these changes made sense. In practice, they backfired. Improving quality and logistics meant higher cost, which Wish couldn't afford while still losing money. Also, the stock market was not kind. Wish went public in December 2020 at $24 per share. By December 2021, it was trading around $3. By 2022, it dropped below $1. The company that had been worth $14 billion at its peak was suddenly worth less than $1 billion. Investors had lost faith. And honestly, could you blame them? The path to profitability seemed further away than ever. In 2022, Wish was acquired for parts and taken private again at a valuation of just $173 million. That's a 99% drop from their peak. So what went wrong? How did a company with 500 million downloads, over 100 million active users, and billions in revenue end up worth basically nothing? The answer is actually pretty straightforward. Wish built a business model that fundamentally didn't work. They attracted customers by selling stuff below cost, then tried to make it up with scale, offering cheap knockoffs that didn't guarantee a loyal customer base. Compare this to Amazon's early years. Amazon also lost money for a long time, but Amazon was investing in infrastructure, logistics, and technology that created real competitive advantages. They built warehouses, distribution networks, and systems that made them genuinely better at e-commerce than anyone else. Wish just connected buyers to merchants and hoped cheap prices were enough. When that stopped being enough, they had nothing to fall back on. There's also a broader lesson here about international e-commerce. Wish's entire model depended on exploiting regulatory arbitrage, cheap shipping due to postal treaties, no tariffs due to the de minimis exemption, minimal oversight on product safety and quality. That worked for a while, but it was never sustainable. As soon as governments started paying attention, the foundation crumbled. You can't build a long-term business on loopholes that could close at any moment. But Wish tried anyway, and they paid the price. Let's bring it back to Sarah. Her order arrived 7 weeks later. Everything was terrible. She left bad reviews, complained to customer service, who responded with generic messages, and eventually just forgot about Wish entirely. She's not alone. Millions of users had similar experiences. The initial excitement wore off, the novelty faded, and they moved on to other shopping apps that might actually deliver something decent. So, back to the original question, how does Wish make money? The honest answer is, they don't. They never really did. At their peak, they generated billions in revenue, but they were losing hundreds of millions per year. They burned through investor money to grow as fast as possible, hoping to figure out profitability later, but later never came. The business model was fundamentally broken from the start. You can't sell products below cost forever. You can't build customer loyalty on disappointment. And you can't base your entire business on regulatory loopholes that might disappear. Wish tried to do all three, and it failed spectacularly. That $4 smartwatch Sarah bought wasn't just a bad product. It was a symbol of everything wrong with Wish's approach. Prioritize price over everything, hope customers don't care about quality, and figure out the economics later. Except customers did care, and the economics never worked out. And now Wish is just a cautionary tale about what happens when you build a business on hype instead of fundamentals.